Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government insists its promises will last forever. And every time, history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have gone to sleep believing their savings were solid and woken up to find them worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures quietly confiscated by systems they thought were permanent. Once that confiscation occurs, there is no appeal window and no orderly unwind. What was counted as security becomes an unrecoverable entry on a ledger. Collapse is not the exception, it is the recurring outcome. Every collapse follows the same progression, where money is stretched, leverage builds on top of it, confidence fractures, and liquidity determines who survives. The real question is not whether financial systems fail, but how you stand when they do. Because the illusion of permanence is the first assumption that disappears. And once it disappears, rebuilding trust requires more than time. We look at bank balances and national currencies and treat them like bedrock. Yet money is not stone, it is trust. And trust can evaporate before you finish reading the headlines. When that evaporation begins, transactions slow, contracts strain, and delay becomes costly because waiting narrows the set of moves still available. History is brutal precisely because it leaves a trail of broken assurances, and useful because that trail shows what endured and what turned to dust. The survivors were not the ones who believed most deeply in the structure. They were the ones who began doubting before the crack widened, while doubt still allowed repositioning. Take the Byzantine Empire, remembered as Rome's eastern heir that outlived the West by 1,000 years. Its economy revolved around the gold solidus, a coin so consistent that merchants across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia accepted it without hesitation, making it the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. Stability seemed earned, almost permanent, and that confidence hardened into routine, reducing the perceived need for alternatives. You would expect a civilization that watched Rome debase the silver denarius into near-worthless metal to guard its gold more carefully. But centuries later, the Byzantines made the same decision in a different form. They shaved purity, stretched gold thinner, mixed in cheaper alloys, and told themselves the change was manageable. At first, nothing broke. And then, trust did. Once credibility cracked, the coin that anchored Mediterranean trade became political fiction, and the stability it had supported slipped beyond recovery, leaving no mechanism to restore its former acceptance without sacrificing even more credibility. After that crack, trade could no longer rely on the solidus as a shared baseline for future deals. And once a currency stops functioning as a baseline, every contract priced in it becomes a negotiation. Every negotiation raises transaction cost until commerce slows under its own friction. When debasement drained belief from the solidus, paper assurances and imperial decrees could not restore it. The more the state insisted, the less flexible it became, because reversing the policy would have exposed the weakness it had tried to conceal. Merchants who had quietly accumulated real gold or land outside imperial reach retained wealth, while others watched theirs dissolve. And those who delayed moving into tangible assets found the exchange window effectively closed. The first lesson closes a door. Governments cannot resist diluting their money, and when they act, value migrates to assets they cannot counterfeit, leaving late movers with fewer exits. Not every collapse begins with rulers altering coins. Some begin with shocks that rearrange the balance of power overnight. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the Black Death, and between 1347 and 1351, as many as half of all Europeans died, emptying cities, erasing villages, and snapping trade routes that once seemed indispensable. Once those routes broke, commerce could not resume on previous terms. Yet catastrophe shifted leverage. When half the labor force vanishes, labor becomes scarce, and survivors could demand wages that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Land and food, once tight, became abundant relative to people. Families with liquidity, silver goods, or simply the capacity to work, found themselves in a buyer's market, where estates sold for fractions of former prices, and abandoned houses changed hands because those who could act quickly faced little competition. Those without reserves faced the opposite condition and had to accept terms set by whoever still controlled resources, because waiting meant losing bargaining power entirely. The redistribution was not gentle. It was structural, because scarcity of people increased the bargaining power of those who remained, and those with reserves climbed, while those without stayed exposed. Unable to retroactively build liquidity once prices adjusted, the pattern repeated centuries later during COVID. When supply chains fractured, governments printed trillions to prevent seizure, and liquidity once again separated those who could acquire assets from those struggling to cover rent. Housing prices surged, stock markets rebounded, and millions scrambled beneath them, watching opportunity move beyond reach. Once those assets repriced upward, entry costs hardened into a new barrier. Pandemics do not simply destroy, they reassign advantage. Survivors of the Black Death leveraged scarcity into ownership, and survivors of COVID, with cash, absorbed property stocks and businesses others were forced to relinquish. For those forced sellers, the transfer was final, because assets sold under pressure rarely return to original owners. The lesson: Titans. Crises reward reserves and penalize dependence. And the shift happens before most people recognize the door has closed, after which participation requires more capital than before. Banking collapses carry the same pattern in a different costume. In the 1340s, Florence stood as Europe's financial capital, home to powerful banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi, whose loans extended to kings. When Edward III of England defaulted during his wars with France, repayment stopped, and the institutions that appeared unassailable fell in sequence, unable to absorb the shock without admitting insolvency. Depositors were ruined, trade froze, and a city accustomed to wealth entered turmoil. Once the banks collapsed, depositors could not retroactively diversify, because the concentration of their savings had already determined the outcome. The ordinary citizen who trusted scale and reputation learned that too big to fail is not protection, but marketing. Institutions exist to profit, and when their calculations fail, they preserve themselves first, while those who relied on their promises absorb the loss. Recovery options narrow to what remains outside the failed structure. The sequence echoes forward from Florentine houses to Lehman Brothers in 2008 to Lebanese banks in 2019, where survival belonged to those who understood that institutional guarantees expire without notice. When the guarantee lapses, capital controls, frozen accounts, or bankruptcy proceedings follow, and each step reduces the ability to reposition funds. Trust most heavily, and you inherit the risk. When it breaks, with fewer alternative channels still open, the American Civil War added another layer. Because behind battles and speeches ran a financial war that required printing money to sustain armies. The Union issued greenbacks, backed not by gold but by national promise, and at first the experiment felt bold. Then issuance increased, purchasing power thinned, and inflation began eroding confidence. Each additional issuance committed the government further, because withdrawing currency at scale would have starved the war effort. Once the war effort depended on that issuance, reversing it quickly stopped being an available move. In the Confederacy, desperation accelerated the cycle, and graybacks flooded the economy. By war's end, inflation had reached staggering levels, with prices multiplying while salaries lost meaning before they could be spent. By 1865, Confederate currency was not weak, but dead, and paper promises offered no defense against collapse. Once merchants refused acceptance, there was no path back to stability without a reserve. The Confederacy did not possess. What retained value were hard assets: land, food, gold, items not conjured by decree. Lifelong savings evaporated for ordinary Southerners, while those with tangible goods acquired property at fire sale prices. Those who had converted late discovered that prices had already adjusted against them. The lesson removes comfort. Even your own country has lived through currency death, and when it did trust in paper, offered no shield, while reversing course required resources that had already vanished. France demonstrated how revolutions accelerate decay. In the 1790s, revolutionaries issued assignats, backed by confiscated church lands, intended to stabilize a new order. But repeated printing diluted each issue. Prices spiraled, wages lagged, and farmers refused paper in exchange for food, demanding goods or silver. As refusals spread, the government's capacity to enforce acceptance narrowed, and confidence could not be restored by decree alone. As acceptance vanished, the assignats followed. Bread riots returned to Paris, and the revolution consumed its own currency. Once merchants and farmers declined, paper circulation collapsed, and even those willing to hold it found fewer counterparties. Those holding food, gold, or property endured, while those holding patriotic paper did not. When trust breaks, savings do not shrink gradually. They disappear, and the ability to trade at former terms disappears with them. 2 centuries later, the pattern surfaced in Asia. In 1997, a speculative attack on the Thai baht exposed debts denominated in dollars, and when the peg collapsed, those debts became unpayable overnight. Investors fled, currencies across Southeast Asia tumbled, and economies contracted, while governments appealed to the International Monetary Fund, binding themselves to conditions that further limited domestic flexibility. The heaviest burden fell on ordinary citizens, whose savings depreciated and whose obligations swelled. Once foreign-denominated debt expanded relative to local currency, income repayment required either austerity or default, and both constrained future growth. Those with dollars or assets abroad weathered the storm more effectively than those tied to local currency. Nations dependent on foreign debt accepted austerity, while foreign institutions acquired assets cheaply. Debt in someone else's money closed options quickly, and when the storm arrived, it was the debtor who drowned, because refinancing at favorable terms was no longer on the table. Across Byzantium, France, Civil War, America, and modern Asia, the same progression emerges, where paper collapses, debt constrains, and those who survive are rarely the most trusting. But the earliest to recognize fragility, because early recognition preserves optionality that later vanishes. This is not confined to history books. In Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, banks locked their doors, deposits froze, withdrawals narrowed, and the Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value. Once withdrawals were limited, savers could not move capital abroad or convert at prior rates, and delay compounded losses. With the doors shut and access rationed, keeping savings inside the system stopped being a reversible position. Citizens who believed their savings were secure discovered they had extended unsecured loans to institutions unwilling to repay. Middle-class families, retirees, professionals trust did not discriminate. Those who diversified abroad held gold or property or kept cash outside banks, retained leverage, while those who did not were trapped. Once trapped, exit required accepting steep losses or waiting without guarantee. The assumption that banks always open was removed in a single decision, and the cost of that decision was borne by those inside the system. In 2008, Americans watched homes repossessed and pensions shrink, while the institutions at the center received rescue. In 2020, trillions were printed to sustain the system, inflating asset prices and compressing wage growth, while committing future policy to managing the side effects of that expansion. In 2023, regional banks collapsed rapidly once confidence wavered and once deposits began to flee. Institutions had limited time to stabilize before liquidity ran out. After 2008 and 2020, the system learned to survive through intervention. But survival through intervention reduces the space for future intervention, without accelerating the distortions that required it. So protection cannot rely on a single formula. In Byzantium, it was gold beyond imperial reach. After the Black Death, it was liquidity. In Florence, it was skepticism toward scale. In the Confederacy, it was hard goods. In France, it was food and property. In Asia, it was avoiding foreign-denominated debt. And in Lebanon, it was exiting banks before closure. Each case shows that waiting reduces viable paths, and the details differ, but the constant is that survival comes from recognizing value that persists when illusions end before the system narrows your choices for you. There is a paradox history enforces without sentiment, where collapse is ruin for the unprepared and opportunity for those with resilience, liquidity, or assets immune to printing. After the Black Death, peasants acquired land because scarcity shifted power. And after 2008, cash buyers accumulated homes from foreclosure. For those forced to sell, the transfer was permanent. Protection is not only defense, but positioning, because under pressure, others relinquish what they can no longer hold, and once acquired, those assets rarely revert to previous owners. Wealth is not solely possession, it is capacity. The baker who can provide bread, the craftsman who repairs tools, the farmer who feeds a community, and the merchant who moves goods retain relevance when money falters. When currency weakens, demand for production does not disappear, and those who can meet that demand operate outside the tightest monetary constraints. Production does not lose meaning when currency does, and those who create value rarely remain poor for long because their leverage is tied to necessity rather than paper. That is the deeper safeguard, positioning yourself before the system reveals its constraint. Because once constraint becomes visible, pricing adjusts and repositioning becomes expensive. Every crisis transfers advantage from those who relied on paper to those who held substance, and from passive savers to active builders. Once the transfer occurs, it rarely reverses, and the pattern has not softened with time. So the question is not whether everything eventually fractures, because history answers that plainly. The question is whether you will stand among those clutching promises or those holding something tangible when the fracture arrives. Because by the time fracture is visible to all, repositioning is constrained by what has already been decided. History does not repeat mechanically, but disregard its progression, and the consequence is the same. If this perspective shifted your footing, subscribe. History has already mapped the terrain, and I will show you where to look.